Chapter 22 of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra, Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 22. Mr. Pickwick journeys to Ipswich and meets with a romantic adventure with a middle-aged lady in yellow curl papers. "That air your governor's luggage, Sammy?" inquired Mr. Weller of his affectionate son, as he entered the yard of the Bull Inn, Whitechapel, with a travelling bag and a small portmanteau. "You might ha' made a worser guess than that, old feller," replied Mr. Weller the younger, setting down his burden in the yard, and sitting himself down upon it afterwards. "The governor hisself will be down here presently." "He's a cabbin it, I suppose," said the father. "Yes, he's a havin' 2 mile o' danger at 8d.," responded the son. "How's mother in law this mornin'?" "Queer, Sammy, queer," replied the elder Mr. Weller, with impressive gravity. "She's been gettin' rayther in the Methodistical order lately, Sammy, and she is uncommon pious, to be sure. She's too good a creetur for me, Sammy. I feel I don't deserve her." "Ah," said Mr. Samuel, "that's wery self-denyin' o' you." "Wery," replied his parent with a sigh. "She's got hold o' some inwention for grown up people being born again, Sammy. The new birth, I think they calls it. I should wery much like to see that system in haction, Sammy. I should wery much like to see your mother in law born agin. Wouldn't I put her out to nurse? What do you think them women does t'other day?" continued Mr. Weller, after a short pause, during which he had significantly struck the side of his nose with his forefinger some half-dozen times. "What do you think they does t'other day, Sammy?" "Don't know," replied Sam. "What?" "Goes and gets up a grand tea drinkin' for a feller they calls their shepherd," said Mr. Weller. "I was a standing starin' in at the picter shop down at our place, when I sees a little bill about it. Tickets half a crown. All applications to be made to the committee. Secretary, Mrs. Weller. And when I got home, there was the committee a sittin' in our back parlor. 14 women. I wish you could 'a' heard 'em, Sammy. There they was, a passin' resolutions and wotin' supplies and all sorts o' games. Well, what with your mother in law a worrying me to go, and what with my looking for'ard to seein' some queer starts if I did, I put my name down for a ticket. At 6 o'clock on the Friday evenin' I dresses myself out wery smart, and off I goes with the old 'oman, and up we walks into a fust floor, where there was tea things for 30, and a whole lot o' women as begins whisperin' to one another, and lookin' at me as if they'd never seen a rayther stout gentleman of 58 afore. By and by there comes a great bustle down stairs, and a lanky chap with a red nose and a white neckcloth rushes up and sings out, 'Here's the shepherd a coming to wisit his faithful flock.' And in comes a fat chap in black, with a great white face, a smilin' away like clockwork. Such goin's on, Sammy. 'The kiss of peace,' says the shepherd, and then he kissed the women all round, and ven he'd done, the man with the red nose began. I was just a thinkin' whether I hadn't better begin too, specially as there was a wery nice lady a sittin' next me, ven in comes the tea, and your mother in law, as had been makin' the kettle bile down stairs. At it they went tooth and nail. Such a precious loud hymn, Sammy, while the tea was a brewing, such a grace, such eatin' and drinkin'. I wish you could ha' seen the shepherd walkin' into the ham and muffins. I never see such a chap to eat and drink, never. The red nosed man warn't by no means the sort of person you'd like to grub by contract, but he was nothin' to the shepherd. Well, arter the tea was over, they sang another hymn, and then the shepherd began to preach, and wery well he did it, considerin' how heavy them muffins must have lied on his chest. Presently he pulls up, all of a sudden, and hollers out, 'Where is the sinner? Where is the miserable sinner?' Upon which all the women looked at me, and began to groan as if they was a dying. I thought it was rather sing'lar, but howsever, I says nothing. Presently he pulls up again, and looking wery hard at me, says, 'Where is the sinner? Where is the miserable sinner?' And all the women groans again 10 times louder than afore. I got rather savage at this, so I takes a step or two for'ard, and says, 'My friend,' says I, 'did you apply that ere obserwation to me?' 'Stead of beggin' my pardon as any gentleman would ha' done, he got more abusive than ever. Called me a wessel, Sammy. A wessel of wrath, and all sorts o' names. So my blood being reg'larly up, I first gave him 2 or 3 for himself, and then 2 or 3 more to hand over to the man with the red nose, and walked off. I wish you could have heard how the women screamed, Sammy, when they picked up the shepherd from underneath the table. Hullo! Here's the governor, the size of life." As Mr. Weller spoke, Mr. Pickwick dismounted from a cab and entered the yard. "Fine mornin', sir," said Mr. Weller, senior. "Beautiful indeed," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Beautiful indeed," echoes a red-haired man with an inquisitive nose and green spectacles, who had unpacked himself from a cab at the same moment as Mr. Pickwick. "Going to Ipswich, sir?" "I am," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Extraordinary coincidence. So am I." Mr. Pickwick bowed. "Going outside?" said the red-haired man. Mr. Pickwick bowed again. "Bless my soul, how remarkable! I am going outside, too," said the red-haired man. "We are positively going together." And the red-haired man, who was an important-looking, sharp-nosed, mysterious-spoken personage, with a bird-like habit of giving his head a jerk every time he said anything, smiled as if he had made one of the strangest discoveries that ever fell to the lot of human wisdom. "I am happy in the prospect of your company, sir," said Mr. Pickwick. "Ah," said the newcomer, "it's a good thing for both of us, isn't it? Company, you see, company is it's a very different thing from solitude, ain't it?" "There's no denyin' that air," said Mr. Weller, joining in the conversation with an affable smile. "That's what I call a self-evident proposition, as the dog's meat man said when the housemaid told him he warn't a gentleman." "Ah," said the red-haired man, surveying Mr. Weller from head to foot with a supercilious look. "Friend of yours, sir?" "Not exactly a friend," replied Mr. Pickwick in a low tone. "The fact is, he is my servant. But I allow him to take a good many liberties, for, between ourselves, I flatter myself he is an original, and I am rather proud of him." "Ah," said the red-haired man, "that, you see, is a matter of taste. I am not fond of anything original. I don't like it. I don't see the necessity for it. What's your name, sir?" "Here's my card, sir," replied Mr. Pickwick, much amused by the abruptness of the question and the singular manner of the stranger. "Ah," said the red-haired man, placing the card in his pocket-book. "Pickwick. Very good. I like to know a man's name. It saves so much trouble. That's my card, sir. Magnus, you will perceive, sir. Magnus is my name. It's rather a good name, I think, sir." "A very good name indeed," said Mr. Pickwick, wholly unable to repress a smile. "Yes, I think it is," resumed Mr. Magnus. "There's a good name before it, too, you will observe. Permit me, sir. If you hold the card a little slanting this way, you catch the light upon the upstroke. There. Peter Magnus. Sounds well, I think, sir." "Very," said Mr. Pickwick. "Curious circumstance about those initials, sir," said Mr. Magnus. "You will observe P.M., post meridian. In hasty notes to intimate acquaintance, I sometimes sign myself Afternoon. It amuses my friends very much, Mr. Pickwick." "It is calculated to afford them the highest gratification, I should conceive," said Mr. Pickwick, rather envying the ease with which Mr. Magnus's friends were entertained. "Now, gentlemen," said the hostler, "coach is ready, if you please." "Is all my luggage in?" inquired Mr. Magnus. "All right, sir." "Is the red bag in?" "All right, sir." "And the striped bag?" "4 boot, sir." "And the brown paper parcel?" "Under the seat, sir." "And the leather hat box?" "They're all in, sir." "Now, will you get up?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Excuse me," replied Magnus, standing on the wheel. "Excuse me, Mr. Pickwick, I cannot consent to get up in this state of uncertainty. I am quite satisfied from that man's manner that the leather hat box is not in." The solemn protestations of the hostler being wholly unavailing, the leather hat box was obliged to be raked up from the lowest depth of the boot to satisfy him that it had been safely packed. And after he had been assured on this head, he felt a solemn presentiment, first that the red bag was mislaid, and next that the striped bag had been stolen, and then that the brown paper parcel had come untied. At length, when he had received ocular demonstration of the groundless nature of each and every of these suspicions, he consented to climb up to the roof of the coach, observing that now he had taken everything off his mind he felt quite comfortable and happy. "You're given to nervousness, ain't you, sir?" inquired Mr. Weller, senior, eyeing the stranger askance as he mounted to his place. "Yes, I always am rather about these little matters," said the stranger, "but I am all right now, quite right." "Well, that's a blessin'," said Mr. Weller. "Sammy, help your master up to the box. T'other leg, sir. That's it. Give us your hand, sir. Up with you. You was a lighter weight when you was a boy, sir." "True enough that, Mr. Weller," said the breathless Mr. Pickwick, good humoredly, as he took his seat on the box beside him. "Jump up in front, Sammy," said Mr. Weller. "Now, Willum, run 'em out. Take care of the archway, gentlemen. Heads, as the pieman says. That'll do, Willum. Let 'em alone." And away went the coach up Whitechapel, to the admiration of the whole population of that pretty densely populated quarter. "Not a werry nice neighborhood, this, sir," said Sam, with a touch of the hat, which always preceded his entering into conversation with his master. "It is not, indeed, Sam," replied Mr. Pickwick, surveying the crowded and filthy street through which they were passing. "It's a werry remarkable circumstance, sir," said Sam, "that poverty and oysters always seem to go together." "I don't understand you, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick. "What I mean, sir," said Sam, "is that the poorer a place is, the greater call there seems to be for oysters. Look here, sir. Here's a oyster stall to every half dozen houses. The street's lined with 'em. Blessed if I don't think that ven a man's werry poor he rushes out of his lodgings and eats oysters in reg'lar desperation." "To be sure he does," said Mr. Weller, senior, "and it's just the same with the pickled salmon." "Those are two very remarkable facts which never occurred to me before," said Mr. Pickwick. "The very first place we stop at I'll make a note of them." By this time they had reached the turnpike at Mile End. A profound silence prevailed until they had got 2 or 3 miles farther on, when Mr. Weller, senior, turning suddenly to Mr. Pickwick, said, "Werry queer life is a pike keeper's, sir." "A what?" said Mr. Pickwick. "A pike keeper." "What do you mean by a pike keeper?" inquired Mr. Peter Magnus. "The old un means a turnpike keeper, gentlemen," observed Mr. Samuel Weller, in explanation. "Oh," said Mr. Pickwick, "I see. Yes, very curious life. Very uncomfortable." "They're all on 'em men as has met with some disappointment in life," said Mr. Weller, senior. "Ay, ay," said Mr. Pickwick. "Yes. Consequence of which they retires from the world and shuts themselves up in pikes, partly with the view of being solitary, and partly to rewenge themselves on mankind by takin' tolls." "Dear me," said Mr. Pickwick, "I never knew that before." "Fact, sir," said Mr. Weller. "If they was gentlemen you'd call 'em misanthropes, but as it is, they only takes to pike keepin'." With such conversation, possessing the inestimable charm of blending amusement with instruction, did Mr. Weller beguile the tediousness of the journey during the greater part of the day. Topics of conversation were never wanting, for even when any pause occurred in Mr. Weller's loquacity, it was abundantly supplied by the desire evinced by Mr. Magnus to make himself acquainted with the whole of the personal history of his fellow travelers, and his loudly expressed anxiety at every stage respecting the safety and well being of the 2 bags, the leather hat box, and the brown paper parcel. In the main street of Ipswich, on the left hand side of the way, a short distance after you have passed through the open space fronting the town hall, stands an inn known far and wide by the appellation of the Great White Horse, rendered the more conspicuous by a stone statue of some rampacious animal with flowing mane and tail, distantly resembling an insane cart horse, which is elevated above the principal door. The Great White Horse is famous in the neighborhood, in the same degree as a prize ox, or a county paper chronicled turnip, or unwieldy pig, for its enormous size. Never was such labyrinths of uncarpeted passages, such clusters of moldy, ill lighted rooms, such huge numbers of small dens for eating or sleeping in, beneath any one roof, as are collected together between the 4 walls of the Great White Horse at Ipswich. It was at the door of this overgrown tavern that the London coach stopped, at the same hour every evening. And it was from this same London coach that Mr. Pickwick, Sam Weller, and Mr. Peter Magnus dismounted on the particular evening to which this chapter of our history bears reference. "Do you stop here, sir?" inquired Mr. Peter Magnus, when the striped bag and the red bag, and the brown paper parcel, and the leather hat box had all been deposited in the passage. "Do you stop here, sir?" "I do," said Mr. Pickwick. "Dear me," said Mr. Magnus, "I never knew anything like these extraordinary coincidences. Why, I stop here, too. I hope we dine together." "With pleasure," replied Mr. Pickwick. "I am not quite certain whether I have any friends here or not, though. Is there any gentleman of the name of Tupman here, waiter?" A corpulent man, with a fortnight's napkin under his arm, in coeval stockings on his legs, slowly desisted from his occupation of staring down the street on this question being put to him by Mr. Pickwick, and after minutely inspecting that gentleman's appearance from the crown of his hat to the lowest button of his gaiters, replied emphatically, "No." "Nor any gentleman of the name of Snodgrass?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "No." "Nor Winkle?" "No." "My friends have not arrived to day, sir," said Mr. Pickwick. "We will dine alone, then. Show us a private room, waiter." On this request being preferred, the corpulent man condescended to order the boots to bring in the gentlemen's luggage, and preceding them down a long, dark passage, ushered them into a large, badly furnished apartment with a dirty grate, in which a small fire was making a wretched attempt to be cheerful, but was fast sinking beneath the dispiriting influence of the place. After the lapse of an hour, a bit of fish and a steak was served up to the travelers, and when the dinner was cleared away, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Peter Magnus drew their chairs up to the fire, and having ordered a bottle of the worst possible port wine at the highest possible price for the good of the house, drank brandy and water for their own. Mr. Peter Magnus was naturally of a very communicative disposition, and the brandy and water operated with wonderful effect in warming into life the deepest hidden secrets of his bosom. After sundry accounts of himself, his family, his connections, his friends, his jokes, his business, and his brothers most talkative men have a great deal to say about their brothers Mr. Peter Magnus took a view of Mr. Pickwick through his colored spectacles for several minutes, and then said, with an air of modesty: "And what do you think, Mr. Pickwick, I have come down here for?" "Upon my word," said Mr. Pickwick, "it is wholly impossible for me to guess. On business, perhaps?" "Partly right, sir," replied Mr. Peter Magnus, "but partly wrong at the same time. Try again, Mr. Pickwick." "Really," said Mr. Pickwick, "I must throw myself on your mercy, to tell me or not as you may think best, for I should never guess if I were to try all night." "Why, then," said Mr. Peter Magnus, with a bashful titter, "what should you think, Mr. Pickwick, if I had come down here to make a proposal, sir, eh?" "Think? That you are very likely to succeed," replied Mr. Pickwick, with one of his beaming smiles. "Ah," said Mr. Magnus, "but do you really think so, Mr. Pickwick? Do you, though?" "Certainly," said Mr. Pickwick. "No, but you're joking, though." "I am not, indeed." "Why, then," said Mr. Magnus, "to let you into a little secret, I think so, too. I don't mind telling you, Mr. Pickwick, although I'm dreadful jealous by nature, horrid, that the lady is in this house." Here Mr. Magnus took off his spectacles on purpose to wink, and then put them on again. "That's what you were running out of the room for before dinner, then, so often?" said Mr. Pickwick, archly. "Hush! Yes, you're right. That was it. Not such a fool as to see her, though." "No?" "No, wouldn't do, you know, after having just come off a journey. Wait till to morrow, sir. Double the chance then. Mr. Pickwick, sir, there is a suit of clothes in that bag, and a hat in that box, which I expect, and the effect they will produce, will be invaluable to me, sir." "Indeed!" said Mr. Pickwick. "Yes. You must have observed my anxiety about them to day. I do not believe that such another suit of clothes and such a hat could be bought for money, Mr. Pickwick." Mr. Pickwick congratulated the fortunate owner of the irresistible garments on their acquisition, and Mr. Peter Magnus remained a few moments apparently absorbed in contemplation. "She's a fine creature," said Mr. Magnus. "Is she?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Very," said Mr. Magnus, "very. She lives about 20 miles from here, Mr. Pickwick. I heard she would be here to night and all to morrow forenoon, and came down to seize the opportunity. I think an inn is a good sort of a place to propose to a single woman in, Mr. Pickwick. She is more likely to feel the loneliness of her situation in traveling, perhaps, than she would be at home. What do you think, Mr. Pickwick?" "I think it is very probable," replied that gentleman. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Pickwick," said Mr. Peter Magnus, "but I am naturally rather curious. What may you have come down here for?" "On a far less pleasant errand, sir," replied Mr. Pickwick, the color mounting to his face at the recollection. "I have come down here, sir, to expose the treachery and falsehood of an individual upon whose truth and honor I placed implicit reliance." "Dear me!" said Mr. Peter Magnus, "that's very unpleasant. It is a lady, I presume, eh? Ah? Sly, Mr. Pickwick, sly. Well, Mr. Pickwick, sir, I wouldn't probe your feelings for the world. Painful subjects, these, sir, very painful. Don't mind me, Mr. Pickwick, if you wish to give vent to your feelings. I know what it is to be jolted, sir. I have endured that sort of thing 3 or 4 times." "I am much obliged to you for your condolence on what you presume to be my melancholy case," said Mr. Pickwick, winding up his watch and laying it on the table. "But—" "No, no," said Mr. Peter Magnus, "not a word more. It's a painful subject. I see, I see. What's the time, Mr. Pickwick?" "Past 12." "Dear me! It's time to go to bed. It will never do sitting here. I shall be pale to morrow, Mr. Pickwick." At the bare notion of such a calamity, Mr. Peter Magnus rang the bell for the chambermaid, and the striped bag, the red bag, the leathern hat box, and the brown paper parcel having been conveyed to his bedroom, he retired in company with a japanned candlestick to one side of the house, while Mr. Pickwick and another japanned candlestick were conducted through a multitude of tortuous windings to another. "This is your room, sir," said the chambermaid. "Very well," replied Mr. Pickwick, looking round him. It was a tolerably large double bedded room, with a fire. Upon the whole, a more comfortable looking apartment than Mr. Pickwick's short experience of the accommodations of the Great White Horse had led him to expect. "Nobody sleeps in the other bed, of course?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Oh, no, sir." "Very good. Tell my servant to bring me up some hot water at half past 8 in the morning, and that I shall not want him any more to night." "Yes, sir." And bidding Mr. Pickwick good night, the chambermaid retired and left him alone. Mr. Pickwick sat himself down in a chair before the fire and fell into a train of rambling meditations. First he thought of his friends, and wondered when they would join him. Then his mind reverted to Mrs. Martha Bardell, and from that lady it wandered, by a natural process, to the dingy counting house of Dodson and Fogg. From Dodson and Fogg's it flew off at a tangent to the very center of the history of the queer client, and then it came back to the Great White Horse at Ipswich with sufficient clearness to convince Mr. Pickwick that he was falling asleep. So he roused himself and began to undress, when he recollected he had left his watch on the table downstairs. Now this watch was a special favorite with Mr. Pickwick, having been carried about, beneath the shadow of his waistcoat, for a greater number of years than we feel called upon to state at present. The possibility of going to sleep unless it were ticking gently beneath his pillow, or in the watch pocket over his head, had never entered Mr. Pickwick's brain. So, as it was pretty late now, and he was unwilling to ring his bell at that hour of the night, he slipped on his coat, of which he had just divested himself, and taking the japanned candlestick in his hand, walked quietly downstairs. The more stairs Mr. Pickwick went down, the more stairs there seemed to be to descend. And again, when Mr. Pickwick got into some narrow passage and began to congratulate himself on having gained the ground floor, did another flight of stairs appear before his astonished eyes. At last he reached a stone hall, which he remembered to have seen when he entered the house. Passage after passage did he explore, room after room did he peep into. At length, as he was on the point of giving up the search in despair, he opened the door of the identical room in which he had spent the evening, and beheld his missing property on the table. Mr. Pickwick seized the watch in triumph, and proceeded to retrace his steps to his bedchamber. If his progress downward had been attended with difficulties and uncertainty, his journey back was infinitely more perplexing. Rows of doors, garnished with boots of every shape, make, and size, branched off in every possible direction. A dozen times did he softly turn the handle of some bedroom door, which resembled his own, when a gruff cry from within of "Who the devil's that?" or "What do you want here?" caused him to steal away on tiptoe with a perfectly marvelous celerity. He was reduced to the verge of despair, when an open door attracted his attention. He peeped in. Right at last. There were the two beds, whose situation he perfectly remembered, and the fire still burning. His candle, not a long one when he first received it, had flickered away in the draughts of air through which he had passed, and sank into the socket as he closed the door after him. "No matter," said Mr. Pickwick. "I can undress myself just as well by the light of the fire." The bedsteads stood one on each side of the door, and on the inner side of each was a little path, terminating in a rush-bottomed chair, just wide enough to admit of a person's getting into or out of bed on that side, if he or she thought proper. Having carefully drawn the curtains of his bed on the outside, Mr. Pickwick sat down on the rush-bottomed chair, and leisurely divested himself of his shoes and gaiters. He then took off and folded up his coat, waistcoat, and neckcloth, and slowly drawing on his tasseled nightcap, secured it firmly on his head, by tying beneath his chin the strings which he always had attached to that article of dress. It was at this moment that the absurdity of his recent bewilderment struck upon his mind. Throwing himself back in the rush bottomed chair, Mr. Pickwick laughed to himself so heartily that it would have been quite delightful to any man of well constituted mind to have watched the smiles that expanded his amiable features as they shone forth from beneath the nightcap. "It is the best idea," said Mr. Pickwick to himself, smiling till he almost cracked the nightcap strings. "It is the best idea, my losing myself in this place, and wandering about these staircases, that I ever heard of. Droll, droll, very droll." Here Mr. Pickwick smiled again, a broader smile than before, and was about to continue the process of undressing, in the best possible humor, when he was suddenly stopped by a most unexpected interruption, to wit, the entrance into the room of some person with a candle, who, after locking the door, advanced to the dressing table and set down the light upon it. The smile that played on Mr. Pickwick's features was instantaneously lost in a look of the most unbounded and wonder stricken surprise. The person, whoever it was, had come in so suddenly and with so little noise that Mr. Pickwick had had no time to call out or oppose their entrance. Who could it be? A robber? Some evil minded person who had seen him come upstairs with a handsome watch in his hand, perhaps? What was he to do? The only way in which Mr. Pickwick could catch a glimpse of his mysterious visitor with the least danger of being seen himself was by creeping onto the bed and peeping out from between the curtains on the opposite side. To this maneuver he accordingly resorted. Keeping the curtains carefully closed with his hand, so that nothing more of him could be seen than his face and nightcap, and putting on his spectacles, he mustered up courage and looked out. Mr. Pickwick almost fainted with horror and dismay. Standing before the dressing glass was a middle aged lady in yellow curl papers, busily engaged in brushing what ladies call their back hair. However the unconscious middle aged lady came into that room, it was quite clear that she contemplated remaining there for the night, for she had brought a rushlight and shade with her, which, with praiseworthy precaution against fire, she had stationed in a basin on the floor, where it was glimmering away like a gigantic lighthouse in a particularly small piece of water. "Bless my soul!" thought Mr. Pickwick, "what a dreadful thing!" "Hum!" said the lady, and in went Mr. Pickwick's head with automaton like rapidity. "I never met with anything so awful as this!" thought poor Mr. Pickwick, the cold perspiration starting in drops upon his nightcap. "Never! This is fearful!" It was quite impossible to resist the urgent desire to see what was going forward. So out went Mr. Pickwick's head again. The prospect was worse than before. The middle aged lady had finished arranging her hair, had carefully enveloped it in a muslin nightcap with a small plaited border, and was gazing pensively on the fire. "This matter is growing alarming," reasoned Mr. Pickwick with himself. "I can't allow things to go on in this way. By the self possession of that lady it is clear to me that I must have come into the wrong room. If I call out, she'll alarm the house, but if I remain here the consequences will be still more frightful." Mr. Pickwick, it is quite unnecessary to say, was one of the most modest and delicate minded of mortals. The very idea of exhibiting his nightcap to a lady overpowered him. But he had tied those confounded strings in a knot, and do what he would he couldn't get it off. The disclosure must be made. There was only one other way of doing it. He shrunk behind the curtains and called out, very loudly, "Ha-hum!" That the lady started at this unexpected sound was evident by her falling up against the rushlight shade. That she persuaded herself it must have been the effect of imagination was equally clear, for when Mr. Pickwick, under the impression that she had fainted away stone dead with fright, ventured to peep out again, she was gazing pensively on the fire as before. "Most extraordinary female, this!" thought Mr. Pickwick, popping in again. "Ha-hum!" These last sounds, so like those in which, as legends inform us, the ferocious giant Blunderbore was in the habit of expressing his opinion that it was time to lay the cloth, were too distinctly audible to be again mistaken for the workings of fancy. "Gracious heaven!" said the middle aged lady. "What's that?" "It's "It's only a gentleman, ma'am," said Mr. Pickwick from behind the curtains. "A gentleman!" said the lady, with a terrific scream. "It's all over," thought Mr. Pickwick. "A strange man!" shrieked the lady. Another instant and the house would be alarmed. Her garments rustled as she rushed towards the door. "Ma'am," said Mr. Pickwick, thrusting out his head in the extremity of his desperation, "ma'am!" Now, although Mr. Pickwick was not actuated by any definite object in putting out his head, it was instantaneously productive of a good effect. The lady, as we have already stated, was near the door. She must pass it to reach the staircase, and she would most undoubtedly have done so by this time, had not the sudden apparition of Mr. Pickwick's nightcap driven her back into the remotest corner of the apartment, where she stood staring wildly at Mr. Pickwick, while Mr. Pickwick, in his turn, stared wildly at her. "Wretch!" said the lady, covering her eyes with her hands, "what do you want here?" "Nothing, ma'am, nothing whatever, ma'am," said Mr. Pickwick earnestly. "Nothing!" said the lady, looking up. "Nothing, ma'am, upon my honor," said Mr. Pickwick, nodding his head so energetically that the tassel of his nightcap danced again. "I am almost ready to sink, ma'am, beneath the confusion of addressing a lady in my nightcap." Here the lady hastily snatched off hers. "But I can't get it off, ma'am." Here Mr. Pickwick gave it a tremendous tug in proof of the statement. "It is evident to me, ma'am, now, that I have mistaken this bedroom for my own. I had not been here 5 minutes, ma'am, when you suddenly entered it." "If this improbable story be really true, sir," said the lady, sobbing violently, "you will leave it instantly." "I will, ma'am, with the greatest pleasure," replied Mr. Pickwick. "Instantly, sir," said the lady. "Certainly, ma'am," interposed Mr. Pickwick, very quickly. "Certainly, ma'am. I am very sorry, ma'am," said Mr. Pickwick, making his appearance at the bottom of the bed, "to have been the innocent occasion of this alarm and emotion. Deeply sorry, ma'am." The lady pointed to the door. One excellent quality of Mr. Pickwick's character was beautifully displayed at this moment, under the most trying circumstances. Although he had hastily put on his hat over his nightcap, after the manner of the old patrol, although he carried his shoes and gaiters in his hand, and his coat and waistcoat over his arm, nothing could subdue his native politeness. "I am exceedingly sorry, ma'am," said Mr. Pickwick, bowing very low. "If you are, sir, you will at once leave the room," said the lady. "Immediately, ma'am. This instant, ma'am," said Mr. Pickwick, opening the door and dropping both his shoes with a crash in so doing. "I trust, ma'am," resumed Mr. Pickwick, gathering up his shoes, and turning round to bow again, "I trust, ma'am, that my unblemished character, and the devoted respect I entertain for your sex, will plead as some slight excuse for this." But before Mr. Pickwick could conclude the sentence, the lady had thrust him into the passage, and locked and bolted the door behind him. Whatever grounds of self congratulation Mr. Pickwick might have for having escaped so quietly from his late awkward situation, his present position was by no means enviable. He was alone, in an open passage, in a strange house in the middle of the night, half dressed. It was not to be supposed that he could find his way in perfect darkness to a room which he had been wholly unable to discover with a light, and if he made the slightest noise in his fruitless attempts to do so, he stood every chance of being shot at, and perhaps killed, by some wakeful traveller. He had no resource but to remain where he was until daylight appeared. So, after groping his way a few paces down the passage, and to his infinite alarm stumbling over several pairs of boots in so doing, Mr. Pickwick crouched into a little recess in the wall to wait for morning as philosophically as he might. He was not destined, however, to undergo this additional trial of patience, for he had not been long ensconced in his present concealment when, to his unspeakable horror, a man, bearing a light, appeared at the end of the passage. His horror was suddenly converted into joy, however, when he recognized the form of his faithful attendant. It was indeed Mr. Samuel Weller, who, after sitting up thus late, in conversation with the boots, who was sitting up for the mail, was now about to retire to rest. "Sam!" said Mr. Pickwick, suddenly appearing before him, "where's my bedroom?" Mr. Weller stared at his master with the most emphatic surprise, and it was not until the question had been repeated 3 several times that he turned round and led the way to the long sought apartment. "Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, as he got into bed, "I have made one of the most extraordinary mistakes to night that ever were heard of." "Wery likely, sir," replied Mr. Weller, dryly. "But of this I am determined, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, "that if I were to stop in this house for 6 months I would never trust myself about it alone again." "That's the wery prudentest resolution as you could come to, sir," replied Mr. Weller. "You rayther want somebody to look arter you, sir, when your judgment goes out a wisitin'." "What do you mean by that, Sam?" said Mr. Pickwick. He raised himself in bed and extended his hand as if he were about to say something more, but suddenly checking himself, turned round and bade his valet good night. "Good night, sir," replied Mr. Weller. He paused when he got outside the door, shook his head, walked on, stopped, snuffed the candle, shook his head again, and finally proceeded slowly to his chamber, apparently buried in the profoundest meditation. Chapter 23. Of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 23, in which Mr. Samuel Weller begins to devote his energies to the return match between himself and Mr. Trotter. In a small room in the vicinity of the stable yard, betimes in the morning, which was ushered in by Mr. Pickwick's adventure with the middle-aged lady in the yellow curl papers, sat Mr. Weller senior, preparing himself for his journey to London. He was sitting in an excellent attitude for having his portrait taken, and here it is. It is very possible that at some earlier period of his career Mr. Weller's profile might have presented a bold and determined outline. His face, however, had expanded under the influence of good living, and a disposition remarkable for resignation, and its bold fleshy curves had so far extended beyond the limits originally assigned them, that unless you took a full view of his countenance in front, it was difficult to distinguish more than the extreme tip of a very rubicund nose. His chin, from the same cause, had acquired the grave and imposing form which is generally described by prefixing the word double to that expressive feature, and his complexion exhibited that peculiarly mottled combination of colours which is only to be seen in gentlemen of his profession and in underdone roast beef. Round his neck he wore a crimson travelling shawl, which merged into his chin by such imperceptible gradations that it was difficult to distinguish the folds of the one from the folds of the other. Over this he mounted a long waistcoat of a broad pink striped pattern, and over that again a wide-skirted green coat, ornamented with large brass buttons, whereof the two which garnished the waist were so far apart that no man had ever beheld them both at the same time. His hair, which was short, sleek, and black, was just visible beneath the capacious brim of a low-crowned brown hat. His legs were encased in knee-cord breeches and painted top boots, and a copper watch chain, terminating in one seal, and a key of the same material, dangled loosely from his capacious waistband. We have said that Mr. Weller was engaged in preparing for his journey to London. He was taking sustenance, in fact. On the table before him stood a pot of ale, a cold round of beef, and a very respectable-looking loaf, to each of which he distributed his favours in turn, with the most rigid impartiality. He had just cut a mighty slice from the latter, when the footsteps of somebody entering the room caused him to raise his head, and he beheld his son. "Mornin', Sammy," said the father. The son walked up to the pot of ale, and nodding significantly to his parent, took a long draught by way of reply. "Wery good power o' suction, Sammy," said Mr. Weller the elder, looking into the pot, when his first-born had set it down half empty. "You'd a made an uncommon fine oyster, Sammy, if you'd been born in that station o' life." "Yes, I dessay I should a managed to pick up a respectable livin'," replied Sam, applying himself to the cold beef with considerable vigour. "I'm wery sorry, Sammy," said the elder Mr. Weller, shaking up the ale by describing small circles with the pot, preparatory to drinking. "I'm wery sorry, Sammy, to hear from your lips as you let yourself be gammoned by that 'ere Mulberry man."
I always thought up to 3 days ago that the names of Veller and Gammon could never come into contract, Sammy, never. Always except in the case of a widder, of course," said Sam. "Widders, Sammy," replied Mr. Weller, slightly changing colour. "Widders are 'ceptions to every rule. I have heerd how many ordinary women one widder's equal to in pint o' comin' over you. I think it's 25, but I don't rightly know vether it ain't more." "Well, that's pretty well," said Sam. "Besides," continued Mr. Weller, not noticing the interruption, "that's a werry different thing. You know what the counsel said, Sammy, as defended the gentleman as beat his wife at the poker venever he got jolly. 'And arter all, my lord,' says he, 'it's a amiable weakness.' So I says respectin' widders, Sammy, and so you'll say ven you gets as old as me." "I ought to ha' knowed better, I know," said Sam. "Ought to ha' knowed better!" repeated Mr. Weller, striking the table with his fist. "Ought to ha' knowed better! Why, I know a young un as hasn't had half nor quarter your eddication, as hasn't slept about the markets, no, not 6 months, who'd ha' scorned to be let in such a way, scorned it, Sammy." In the excitement of feeling produced by this agonizing reflection, Mr. Weller rang the bell and ordered an additional pint of ale. "Well, it's no use talking about it now," said Sam. "It's over and can't be helped. And that's one consolation, as they always says in Turkey ven they cuts the wrong man's head off. It's my innings now, guv'nor, and as soon as I catches hold of this here trotter, I'll have a good un." "I hope you will, Sammy, I hope you will," returned Mr. Weller. "Here's your health, Sammy, and may you speedily wipe off the disgrace as you've inflicted on the family name." In honour of this toast, Mr. Weller imbibed at a draught at least 2/3 of a newly arrived pint, and handed it over to his son to dispose of the remainder, which he instantaneously did. "And now, Sammy," said Mr. Weller, consulting a large double-faced silver watch that hung at the end of the copper chain, "now it's time I was up at the office to get my vay bill and see the coach loaded. For coaches, Sammy, is like guns, they requires to be loaded with werry great care afore they go off." At this parental and professional joke, Mr. Weller, junior, smiled a filial smile. His revered parent continued in a solemn tone: "I'm a goin' to leave you, Samivel, my boy, and there's no tellin' ven I shall see you again. Your mother in law may ha' been too much for me, or 1,000 things may have happened by the time you next hears any news of the celebrated Mr. Veller of the Belle Savage. The family name depends werry much upon you, Samivel, and I hope you'll do what's right by it. Upon all little pints of breedin', I know I may trust you as vell as if it was my own self. So I've only this here one little bit of adwice to give you. If ever you gets to up'ards of 50 and feels disposed to go a marryin' anybody, no matter who, just you shut yourself up in your own room, if you've got one, and pison yourself off hand. Hangin's wulgar, so don't you have nothin' to say to that. Pison yourself, Samivel, my boy, pison yourself, and you'll be glad on it arterwards." With these affecting words, Mr. Weller looked steadfastly on his son, and turning slowly upon his heel, disappeared from his sight. In the contemplative mood which these words had awakened, Mr. Samuel Weller walked forth from the Great White Horse when his father had left him, and bending his steps towards St. Clement's Church, endeavoured to dissipate his melancholy by strolling among its ancient precincts. He had loitered about for some time when he found himself in a retired spot, a kind of courtyard of venerable appearance, which he discovered had no other outlet than the turning by which he had entered. He was about retracing his steps, when he was suddenly transfixed to the spot by a sudden appearance, and the mode and manner of this appearance we now proceed to relate. Mr. Samuel Weller had been staring up at the old brick houses now and then in his deep abstraction, bestowing a wink upon some healthy-looking servant girl as she drew up a blind, or threw open a bedroom window, when the green gate of a garden at the bottom of the yard opened, and a man having emerged therefrom closed the green gate very carefully after him, and walked briskly towards the very spot where Mr. Weller was standing. Now, taking this as an isolated fact, unaccompanied by any attendant circumstances, there was nothing very extraordinary in it, because in many parts of the world men do come out of gardens, close green gates after them, and even walk briskly away, without attracting any particular share of public observation. It is clear, therefore, that there must have been something in the man, or in his manner, or both, to attract Mr. Weller's particular notice. Whether there was or not, we must leave the reader to determine when we have faithfully recorded the behaviour of the individual in question. When the man had shut the green gate after him, he walked, as we have said twice already, with a brisk pace up the courtyard. But he no sooner caught sight of Mr. Weller than he faltered, and stopped, as if uncertain for the moment what course to adopt. As the green gate was closed behind him, and there was no other outlet but the one in front, however, he was not long in perceiving that he must pass Mr. Samuel Weller to get away. He therefore resumed his brisk pace, and advanced, staring straight before him. The most extraordinary thing about the man was, that he was contorting his face into the most fearful and astonishing grimaces that ever were beheld. Nature's handiwork never was disguised with such extraordinary artificial carving as the man had overlaid his countenance with in one moment. "Well," said Mr. Weller to himself as the man approached, "this is wery odd. I could have swore it was him." Up came the man, and his face became more frightfully distorted than ever as he drew nearer. "I could take my oath to that 'ere black hair and mulberry suit," said Mr. Weller, "only I never see such a face as that afore." As Mr. Weller said this, the man's features assumed an unearthly twinge, perfectly hideous. He was obliged to pass very near Sam, however, and the scrutinizing glance of that gentleman enabled him to detect, under all these appalling twists of feature, something too like the small eyes of Mr. Job Trotter to be easily mistaken. "Hullo, you, sir!" shouted Sam fiercely. The stranger stopped. "Hullo!" repeated Sam, still more gruffly. The man with the horrible face looked with the greatest surprise up the court and down the court, and in at the windows of the houses, everywhere but at Sam Weller, and took another step forward, when he was brought to again by another shout. "Hullo, you, sir!" said Sam for the third time. There was no pretending to mistake where the voice came from now, so the stranger, having no other resource, at last looked Sam Weller full in the face. "It won't do, Job Trotter," said Sam. "Come, none of that 'ere nonsense. You ain't so wery 'andsome that you can afford to throw avay many o' your good looks. Bring them 'ere eyes o' yourn back into their proper places, or I'll knock 'em out of your head, d'ye hear?" As Mr. Weller appeared fully disposed to act up to the spirit of this address, Mr. Trotter gradually allowed his face to resume its natural expression, and then, giving a start of joy, exclaimed, "What do I see? Mr. Walker!" "Ah," replied Sam, "you're wery glad to see me, ain't you?" "Glad!" exclaimed Job Trotter. "Oh, Mr. Walker, if you had but known how I have looked forward to this meeting! It is too much, Mr. Walker. I cannot bear it, indeed I cannot." And with these words Mr. Trotter burst into a regular inundation of tears, and flinging his arms around those of Mr. Weller, embraced him closely in an ecstasy of joy. "Get off!" cried Sam, indignant at this process, and vainly endeavouring to extricate himself from the grasp of his enthusiastic acquaintance. "Get off, I tell you! What are you crying over me for, you portable engine?" "'Cause I am so glad to see you," replied Job Trotter, gradually releasing Mr. Weller as the first symptoms of his pugnacity disappeared. "Oh, Mr. Walker, this is too much." "Too much!" echoed Sam. "I think it is too much, rayther. Now what have you got to say to me, eh?" Mr. Trotter made no reply, for the little pink pocket handkerchief was in full force. "What have you got to say to me afore I knock your head off?" repeated Mr. Weller in a threatening manner. "Eh?" said Mr. Trotter, with a look of virtuous surprise. "What have you got to say to me?" "Mr. Walker." "Don't call me Walker. My name's Veller. You know that vell enough. What have you got to say to me?" "Bless you, Mr. Walker, Weller, I mean a great many things. If you will come away somewhere where we can talk comfortably. If you knew how I have looked for you, Mr. Weller." "Wery hard indeed, I suppose," said Sam dryly. "Very, very, sir," replied Mr. Trotter, without moving a muscle of his face. "But shake hands, Mr. Weller." Sam eyed his companion for a few seconds, and then, as if actuated by a sudden impulse, complied with his request. "How," said Job Trotter, as they walked away, "how is your dear good master? Oh, he is a worthy gentleman, Mr. Weller. I hope he didn't catch cold that dreadful night, sir." There was a momentary look of deep slyness in Job Trotter's eye as he said this, which ran a thrill through Mr. Weller's clenched fist, as he burned with the desire to make a demonstration on his ribs. Sam constrained himself, however, and replied that his master was extremely well. "Oh, I am so glad," replied Mr. Trotter. "Is he here?" "Is yourn?" asked Sam, by way of reply. "Oh, yes, he is here, and I grieve to say, Mr. Weller, he is going on worse than ever." "Ah, ah," said Sam. "Oh, shocking, terrible." "At a boarding school?" said Sam. "No, not at a boarding school," replied Job Trotter, with the same sly look which Sam had noticed before. "Not at a boarding school." "At the house with the green gate?" said Sam, eyeing his companion closely. "No, no, oh, not there," replied Job, with a quickness very unusual to him. "Not there." "What was you a doing there?" asked Sam, with a sharp glance. "Got inside the gate by accident, perhaps?" "Why, Mr. Weller," replied Job, "I don't mind telling you my little secrets, because, you know, we took such a fancy for each other when we first met. You recollect how pleasant we were that morning?" "Oh, yes," said Sam impatiently, "I remember. Well?" "Well," replied Job, speaking with great precision, and in the low tone of a man who communicates an important secret, "in that house with the green gate, Mr. Weller, they keep a good many servants." "So I should think, from the look on it," interposed Sam. "Yes," continued Mr. Trotter, "and one of them is a cook, who has saved up a little money, Mr. Weller, and is desirous, if she can establish herself in life, to open a little shop in the chandlery way, you see." "Yes." "Yes, Mr. Weller. Well, sir, I met her at a chapel that I go to, a very neat little chapel in this town, Mr. Weller, where they sing the No. 4 collection of hymns, which I generally carry about with me in a little book, which you may perhaps have seen in my hand, and I got a little intimate with her, Mr. Weller, and from that an acquaintance sprung up between us, and I may venture to say, Mr. Weller, that I am to be the chandler." "Ah, and a wery amiable chandler you'll make," replied Sam, eyeing Job with a side look of intense dislike. "The great advantage of this, Mr. Weller," continued Job, his eyes filling with tears as he spoke, "will be that I shall be able to leave my present disgraceful service with that bad man, and to devote myself to a better and more virtuous life, more like the way in which I was brought up, Mr. Weller." "You must have been wery nicely brought up," said Sam. "Oh, very, Mr. Weller, very," replied Job. At the recollection of the purity of his youthful days, Mr. Trotter pulled forth the pink handkerchief and wept copiously. "You must have been an uncommon nice boy to go to school with," said Sam. "I was, sir," replied Job, heaving a deep sigh. "I was the idol of the place." "Ah," said Sam, "I don't wonder at it. What a comfort you must have been to your blessed mother." At these words Mr. Job Trotter inserted an end of the pink handkerchief into the corner of each eye, one after the other, and began to weep copiously. "What's the matter with the man?" said Sam indignantly. "Chelsea Waterworks is nothing to you. What are you melting with now, the consciousness of willainy?" "I cannot keep my feelings down, Mr. Weller," said Job, after a short pause. "To think that my master should have suspected the conversation I had with yours, and so dragged me away in a post chaise, and after persuading the sweet young lady to say she knew nothing of him, and bribing the schoolmistress to do the same, deserted her for a better speculation. Oh, Mr. Weller, it makes me shudder." "Oh, that was the vay, was it?" said Mr. Weller. "To be sure it was," replied Job. "Vell," said Sam, as they had now arrived near the hotel, "I want to have a little bit of talk with you, Job, so if you're not particular engaged, I should like to see you at the Great White Horse to night, somewheres about 8 o'clock." "I shall be sure to come," said Job. "Yes, you'd better," replied Sam, with a very meaning look, "or else I shall perhaps be asking arter you at the other side of the green gate, and then I might cut you out, you know." "I shall be sure to be with you, sir," said Mr. Trotter, and wringing Sam's hand with the utmost fervour, he walked away. "Take care, Job Trotter, take care," said Sam, looking after him, "or I shall be one too many for you this time. I shall indeed." Having uttered this soliloquy, and looked after Job till he was to be seen no more, Mr. Weller made the best of his way to his master's bedroom. "It's all in training, sir," said Sam. "What's in training, Sam?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "I've found 'em out, sir," said Sam. "Found out who?" "That 'ere queer customer and the melancholy chap with the black hair." "Impossible, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick with the greatest energy. "Where are they, Sam, where are they?" "Hush, hush," replied Mr. Weller, and as he assisted Mr. Pickwick to dress, he detailed the plan of action on which he proposed to enter. "But when is this to be done, Sam?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "All in good time, sir," replied Sam. Whether it was done in good time or not will be seen hereafter. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Debra, Lynn. The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Chapter 24, wherein Mr. Peter Magnus grows jealous and the middle-aged lady apprehensive, which brings the Pickwickians within the grasp of the law. When Mr. Pickwick descended to the room in which he and Mr. Peter Magnus had spent the preceding evening, he found that gentleman with the major part of the contents of the 2 bags, the leathern hat box, and the brown paper parcel displaying to all possible advantage on his person, while he himself was pacing up and down the room in a state of the utmost excitement and agitation. "Good morning, sir," said Mr. Peter Magnus. "What do you think of this, sir?" "Very effective indeed," replied Mr. Pickwick, surveying the garments of Mr. Peter Magnus with a good-natured smile. "Yes, I think it'll do," said Mr. Magnus. "Mr. Pickwick, sir, I have sent up my card." "Have you?" said Mr. Pickwick. "And the waiter brought back word that she would see me at 11. At 11, sir. It only wants a quarter now." "Very near the time," said Mr. Pickwick. "Yes, it is rather near," replied Mr. Magnus. "Rather too near to be pleasant, eh, Mr. Pickwick, sir?" "Confidence is a great thing in these cases," observed Mr. Pickwick. "I believe it is, sir," said Mr. Peter Magnus. "I am very confident, sir. Really, Mr. Pickwick, I do not see why a man should feel any fear in such a case as this, sir." "What is it, sir? There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's a matter of mutual accommodation, nothing more. Husband on one side, wife on the other. That's my view of the matter, Mr. Pickwick." "It is a very philosophical one," replied Mr. Pickwick. "But breakfast is waiting, Mr. Magnus. Come." Down they sat to breakfast, but it was evident, notwithstanding the boasting of Mr. Peter Magnus, that he laboured under a very considerable degree of nervousness, of which loss of appetite, a propensity to upset the tea things, a spectral attempt at drollery, and an irresistible inclination to look at the clock every other second, were among the principal symptoms. Tittered Mr. Magnus, affecting cheerfulness and gasping with agitation. "It only wants 2 minutes, Mr. Pickwick. Am I pale, sir?" "Not very," replied Mr. Pickwick. There was a brief pause. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Pickwick, but have you ever done this sort of thing in your time?" said Mr. Magnus. "You mean proposing?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Yes." "Never," said Mr. Pickwick with great energy. "Never." "You have no idea, then, how it's best to begin?" said Mr. Magnus. "Why," said Mr. Pickwick, "I may have formed some ideas upon the subject, but as I have never submitted them to the test of experience, I should be sorry if you were induced to regulate your proceedings by them." "I should feel very much obliged to you for any advice, sir," said Mr. Magnus, taking another look at the clock, the hand of which was verging on the 5 minutes past. "Well, sir," said Mr. Pickwick, with the profound solemnity with which that great man could, when he pleased, render his remarks so deeply impressive, "I should commence, sir, with a tribute to the lady's beauty and excellent qualities. From them, sir, I should diverge to my own unworthiness." "Very good," said Mr. Magnus. "Unworthiness for her only, mind, sir," resumed Mr. Pickwick. "For to show that I was not wholly unworthy, sir, I should take a brief review of my past life and present condition. I should argue, by analogy, that to anybody else I must be a very desirable object. I should then expatiate on the warmth of my love and the depth of my devotion. Perhaps I might then be tempted to seize her hand." "Yes, I see," said Mr. Magnus. "That would be a very great point." "I should then, sir," continued Mr. Pickwick, growing warmer as the subject presented itself in more glowing colours before him, "I should then, sir, come to the plain and simple question. Will you have me? I think I am justified in assuming that upon this she would turn away her head. "You think that may be taken for granted?" said Mr. Magnus. "Because if she did not do that at the right place, it would be embarrassing." "I think she would," said Mr. Pickwick. "Upon this, sir, I should squeeze her hand, and I think, Mr. Magnus, that after I had done that, supposing there was no refusal, I should gently draw away the handkerchief, which my slight knowledge of human nature leads me to suppose the lady would be applying to her eyes at the moment, and steal a respectful kiss. I think I should kiss her, Mr. Magnus, and at this particular point I am decidedly of opinion that if the lady were going to take me at all, she would murmur into my ears a bashful acceptance." Mr. Magnus started, gazed on Mr. Pickwick's intelligent face for a short time in silence, and then, the dial pointing to the 10 minutes past, shook him warmly by the hand, and rushed desperately from the room. Mr. Pickwick had taken a few strides to and fro, and the small hand of the clock, following the latter part of his example, had arrived at the figure which indicates the half hour, when the door suddenly opened. He turned round to meet Mr. Peter Magnus, and encountered in his stead the joyous face of Mr. Tupman, the serene countenance of Mr. Winkle, and the intellectual lineaments of Mr. Snodgrass. As Mr. Pickwick greeted them, Mr. Peter Magnus tripped into the room. "My friends, the gentleman I was speaking of, Mr. Magnus," said Mr. Pickwick. "Your servant, gentlemen," said Mr. Magnus, evidently in a high state of excitement. "Mr. Pickwick, allow me to speak to you one moment, sir." As he said this, Mr. Magnus harnessed his forefinger to Mr. Pickwick's buttonhole, and drawing him to a window recess, said, "Congratulate me, Mr. Pickwick. I followed your advice to the very letter." "And it was all correct, was it?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "It was, sir. Could not possibly have been better," replied Mr. Magnus. "Mr. Pickwick, she is mine." "I congratulate you with all my heart," replied Mr. Pickwick, warmly shaking his new friend by the hand. "You must see her, sir," said Mr. Magnus. "This way, if you please. Excuse us for one instant, gentlemen." Hurrying on in this way, Mr. Peter Magnus drew Mr. Pickwick from the room. He paused at the next door in the passage, and tapped gently thereat. "Come in," said a female voice, and in they went. "Miss Witherfield," said Mr. Magnus, "allow me to introduce my very particular friend, Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick, I beg to make you known to Miss Witherfield." The lady was at the upper end of the room. As Mr. Pickwick bowed, he took his spectacles from his waistcoat pocket and put them on, a process which he had no sooner gone through than, uttering an exclamation of surprise, Mr. Pickwick retreated several paces, and the lady, with a half suppressed scream, hid her face in her hands and dropped into a chair. Whereupon Mr. Peter Magnus was stricken motionless on the spot, and gazed from one to the other with a countenance expressive of the extremities of horror and surprise. This certainly was, to all appearance, very unaccountable behaviour. But the fact is, that Mr. Pickwick no sooner put on his spectacles than he at once recognized in the future Mrs. Magnus the lady into whose room he had so unwarrantably intruded on the previous night. And the spectacles had no sooner crossed Mr. Pickwick's nose than the lady at once identified the countenance which she had seen surrounded by all the horrors of a nightcap. So the lady screamed, and Mr. Pickwick started. "Mr. Pickwick!" exclaimed Mr. Magnus, lost in astonishment. "What is the meaning of this, sir? What is the meaning of it, sir?" added Mr. Magnus in a threatening and a louder tone. "Sir," said Mr. Pickwick, somewhat indignant at the very sudden manner in which Mr. Peter Magnus had conjugated himself into the imperative mood, "I decline answering that question." "You decline it, sir?" said Mr. Magnus. "I do, sir," replied Mr. Pickwick. "I object to say anything which may compromise that lady, or awaken unpleasant recollections in her breast, without her consent and permission." "Miss Witherfield," said Mr. Peter Magnus, "do you know this person?" "Know him?" repeated the middle-aged lady, hesitating. "Yes, know him, ma'am. I said know him," replied Mr. Magnus, with ferocity. "I have seen him," replied the middle-aged lady. "Where?" inquired Mr. Magnus. "Where?" "That," said the middle-aged lady, rising from her seat and averting her head, "that I would not reveal for worlds." "I understand you, ma'am," said Mr. Pickwick, "and respect your delicacy. It shall never be revealed by me, depend upon it." "Upon my word, ma'am," said Mr. Magnus, "considering the situation in which I am placed with regard to yourself, you carry this matter off with tolerable coolness. Tolerable coolness, ma'am!" "Cruel Mr. Magnus!" said the middle-aged lady. Here she wept very copiously indeed. "Address your observations to me, sir," interposed Mr. Pickwick. "I alone am to blame if anybody be." "Oh! You alone are to blame, are you, sir?" said Mr. Magnus. "I see through this, sir. You repent of your determination now, do you?" "My determination!" said Mr. Pickwick. "Your determination, sir. Oh, don't stare at me, sir," said Mr. Magnus. "I recollect your words last night, sir. You came down here, sir, to expose the treachery and falsehood of an individual on whose truth and honour you had placed implicit reliance, eh?" Here Mr. Peter Magnus indulged in a prolonged sneer, and taking off his green spectacles, which he probably found superfluous in his fit of jealousy, rolled his little eyes about in a manner frightful to behold. "Eh?" said Mr. Magnus, and then he repeated the sneer with increased effect. "But you shall answer it, sir." "Answer what?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Never mind, sir," replied Mr. Magnus, striding up and down the room. "Never mind." There must be something very comprehensive in this phrase of "never mind," for we do not recollect to have ever witnessed a quarrel in the street, at a theatre, public room, or elsewhere, in which it has not been the standard reply to all belligerent inquiries. "Do you call yourself a gentleman, sir?" "Never mind, sir." "Did I offer to say anything to the young woman, sir?" "Never mind, sir." "Do you want your head knocked up against that wall, sir?" "Never mind, sir." It is observable, too, that there would appear to be some hidden taunt in this universal "never mind," which rouses more indignation in the bosom of the individual addressed than the most lavish abuse could possibly awaken. We do not mean to assert that the application of this brevity to himself struck exactly that indignation to Mr. Pickwick's soul which it would infallibly have roused in a vulgar breast. We merely record the fact that Mr. Pickwick opened the room door, and abruptly called out, "Tupman, come here." Mr. Tupman immediately presented himself, with a look of very considerable surprise. "Tupman," said Mr. Pickwick, "a secret of some delicacy, in which that lady is concerned, is the cause of a difference which has just arisen between this gentleman and myself. When I assure him, in your presence, that it has no relation to himself, and is not in any way connected with his affairs, I need hardly beg you to take notice that, if he continue to dispute it, he expresses a doubt of my veracity, which I shall consider extremely insulting." As Mr. Pickwick said this, he looked encyclopedias at Mr. Peter Magnus. Mr. Pickwick's upright and honourable bearing, coupled with that force and energy of speech which so eminently distinguished him, would have carried conviction to any reasonable mind; but, unfortunately, at that particular moment, the mind of Mr. Peter Magnus was in anything but reasonable order. Consequently, instead of receiving Mr. Pickwick's explanation as he ought to have done, he forthwith proceeded to work himself into a red-hot, scorching, consuming passion, and to talk about what was due to his own feelings, and all that sort of thing, adding force to his declamation by striding to and fro and pulling his hair, amusements which he would vary occasionally by shaking his fist in Mr. Pickwick's philanthropic countenance. Mr. Pickwick, in his turn, conscious of his own innocence and rectitude, and irritated by having unfortunately involved the middle-aged lady in such an unpleasant affair, was not so quietly disposed as was his wont. The consequence was, that words ran high, and voices higher, and at length Mr. Magnus told Mr. Pickwick he should hear from him; to which Mr. Pickwick replied, with laudable politeness, that the sooner he heard from him the better. Whereupon the middle-aged lady rushed in terror from the room, out of which Mr. Tupman dragged Mr. Pickwick, leaving Mr. Peter Magnus to himself and meditation. If the middle-aged lady had mingled much with the busy world, or had profited at all by the manners and customs of those who make the laws and set the fashions, she would have known that this sort of ferocity is the most harmless thing in nature; but, as she had lived for the most part in the country, and never read the parliamentary debates, she was little versed in these particular refinements of civilized life. Accordingly, when she had gained her bedchamber, bolted herself in, and began to meditate on the scene she had just witnessed, the most terrific pictures of slaughter and destruction presented themselves to her imagination, among which a full-length portrait of Mr. Peter Magnus, borne home by 4 men, with the embellishment of a whole barrelful of bullets in his left side, was among the very least. The more the middle-aged lady meditated, the more terrified she became, and at length she determined to repair to the house of the principal magistrate of the town, and request him to secure the persons of Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Tupman without delay. To this decision the middle-aged lady was impelled by a variety of considerations, the chief of which was the incontestable proof it would afford of her devotion to Mr. Peter Magnus, and her anxiety for his safety. She was too well acquainted with his jealous temperament to venture the slightest allusion to the real cause of her agitation on beholding Mr. Pickwick, and she trusted to her own influence and power of persuasion with the little man to quell his boisterous jealousy, supposing that Mr. Pickwick were removed and no fresh quarrel could arise. Filled with these reflections, the middle-aged lady arrayed herself in her bonnet and shawl, and repaired to the mayor's dwelling straightway. Now George Nupkins, Esquire, the principal magistrate aforesaid, was as grand a personage as the fastest walker would find out between sunrise and sunset on the 21st of June, which being, according to the almanacs, the longest day in the whole year, would naturally afford him the longest period for his search. On this particular morning Mr. Nupkins was in a state of the utmost excitement and irritation, for there had been a rebellion in the town. All the day scholars at the largest day school had conspired to break the windows of an obnoxious apple seller, and had hooted the beadle and pelted the constabulary, an elderly gentleman in top boots, who had been called out to repress the tumult, and who had been a peace officer, man and boy, for half a century at least. And Mr. Nupkins was sitting in his easy chair, frowning with majesty and boiling with rage, when a lady was announced on pressing, private, and particular business. Mr. Nupkins looked calmly terrible, and commanded that the lady should be shown in, which command, like all the mandates of emperors and magistrates and other great potentates of the earth, was forthwith obeyed, and Miss Witherfield, interestingly agitated, was ushered in accordingly. "Muzzle!" said the magistrate. Muzzle was an undersized footman with a long body and short legs. "Muzzle!" "Yes, your worship." "Place a chair and leave the room." "Yes, your worship." "Now, ma'am, will you state your business?" said the magistrate. "It is of a very painful kind, sir," said Miss Witherfield. "Very likely, ma'am," said the magistrate. "Compose your feelings, ma'am." Here Mr. Nupkins looked benignant. "And then tell me what legal business brings you here, ma'am." Here the magistrate triumphed over the man, and he looked stern again. "It is very distressing to me, sir, to give this information," said Miss Witherfield, "but I fear a duel is going to be fought here." "Here, ma'am?" said the magistrate. "Where, ma'am?" "In Ipswich." "In Ipswich, ma'am? A duel in Ipswich?" said the magistrate, perfectly aghast at the notion. "Impossible, ma'am. Nothing of the kind can be contemplated in this town, I am persuaded. Bless my soul, ma'am, are you aware of the activity of our local magistracy? Do you happen to have heard, ma'am, that I rushed into a prize ring on the 4th of May last, attended by only 60 special constables, and, at the hazard of falling a sacrifice to the angry passions of an infuriated multitude, prohibited a pugilistic contest between the Middlesex dumpling and the Suffolk bantam? A duel in Ipswich, ma'am! I do not think," said the magistrate, reasoning with himself, "that any two men can have had the hardihood to plan such a breach of the peace in this town." "My information is, unfortunately, but too correct," said the middle-aged lady. "I was present at the quarrel." "It's a most extraordinary thing," said the astounded magistrate. "Muzzle!" "Yes, your worship." "Send Mr. Jinks here directly, instantly." "Yes, your worship." Muzzle retired, and a pale, sharp-nosed, half-fed, shabbily clad clerk of middle age entered the room. "Mr. Jinks?" said the magistrate. "Mr. Jinks?" "Sir?" said Mr. Jinks. "This lady, Mr. Jinks, has come here to give information of an intended duel in this town." Mr. Jinks, not knowing exactly what to do, smiled a dependent's smile. "What are you laughing at, Mr. Jinks?" said the magistrate. Mr. Jinks looked serious instantly. "Mr. Jinks," said the magistrate, "you're a fool." Mr. Jinks looked humbly at the great man, and bit the top of his pen. "You may see something very comical in this information, sir, but I can tell you this, Mr. Jinks, that you have very little to laugh at," said the magistrate. The hungry-looking Jinks sighed, as if he were quite aware of the fact of his having very little indeed to be merry about, and being ordered to take the lady's information, shambled to a seat and proceeded to write it down. "This man Pickwick is the principal, I understand?" said the magistrate when the statement was finished. "He is." said the middle-aged lady. "And the other rioter, what's his name, Mr. Jinks?" "Tupman, sir." "Tupman is the second?" "Yes." "The other principal, you say, has absconded, ma'am?" "Yes," replied Miss Witherfield, with a short cough. "Very well," said the magistrate. "These are two cut-throats from London, who have come down here to destroy his Majesty's population, thinking that at this distance from the capital the arm of the law is weak and paralyzed. They shall be made an example of. Draw up the warrants, Mr. Jinks." "Muzzle!" "Yes, your worship." "Is Grummer downstairs?" "Yes, your worship." "Send him up." The obsequious Muzzle retired, and presently returned, introducing the elderly gentleman in the top boots, who was chiefly remarkable for a bottle nose, a hoarse voice, a snuff-coloured surtout, and a wandering eye. "Grummer," said the magistrate. "Your washup." "Is the town quiet now?" "Pretty well, your washop," replied Grummer. "Poplar feeling has in a measure subsided, consequence of the boys having dispersed to cricket." "Nothing but vigorous measures will do in these times, Grummer," said the magistrate, in a determined manner. "If the authority of the King's officers is set at naught, we must have the Riot Act read. If the civil power cannot protect these windows, Grummer, the military must protect the civil power and the windows too. I believe that is a maxim of the Constitution. Mr. Jinks?" "Certainly, sir," said Jinks. "Very good," said the magistrate, signing the warrants. "Grummer, you will bring these persons before me, this afternoon. You will find them at the Great White Horse. You recollect the case of the Middlesex dumpling and the Suffolk bantam, Grummer?" Mr. Grummer intimated by a retrospective shake of the head that he should never forget it, as indeed it was not likely he would so long as it continued to be cited daily. "This is even more unconstitutional," said the magistrate. "This is even a greater breach of the peace and a grosser infringement of his Majesty's prerogative. I believe duelling is one of his Majesty's most undoubted prerogatives. Mr. Jinks?" "Expressly stipulated in Magna Carta, sir," said Mr. Jinks. "One of the brightest jewels in the British crown, wrung from his Majesty by the barons, I believe, Mr. Jinks?" said the magistrate. "Just so, sir," replied Mr. Jinks. "Very well," said the magistrate, drawing himself up proudly. "It shall not be violated in this portion of his dominions. Grummer, procure assistance and execute these warrants with as little delay as possible. Muzzle!" "Yes, your worship." "Show the lady out." Miss Witherfield retired, deeply impressed with the magistrate's learning and research. Mr. Nupkins retired to lunch. Mr. Jinks retired within himself, that being the only retirement he had, except the sofa bedstead in the small parlour, which was occupied by his landlady's family in the daytime, and Mr. Grummer retired to wipe out, by his mode of discharging his present commission, the insult which had been fastened upon himself and the other representative of his Majesty, the beadle, in the course of the morning. While these resolute and determined preparations for the conservation of the King's peace were pending, Mr. Pickwick and his friends, wholly unconscious of the mighty events in progress, had sat quietly down to dinner, and very talkative and companionable they all were. Mr. Pickwick was in the very act of relating his adventure of the preceding night, to the great amusement of his followers, Mr. Tupman especially, when the door opened and a somewhat forbidding countenance peeped into the room. The eyes in the forbidding countenance looked very earnestly at Mr. Pickwick for several seconds, and were, to all appearance, satisfied with their investigation; for the body to which the forbidding countenance belonged slowly brought itself into the apartment, and presented the form of an elderly individual in top boots. Not to keep the reader any longer in suspense, in short, the eyes were the wandering eyes of Mr. Grummer, and the body was the body of the same gentleman. Mr. Grummer's mode of proceeding was professional but peculiar. His first act was to bolt the door on the inside; his second, to polish his head and countenance very carefully with a cotton handkerchief; his third, to place his hat, with the cotton handkerchief in it, on the nearest chair; and his fourth, to produce from the breast pocket of his coat a short truncheon, surmounted by a brazen crown, with which he beckoned to Mr. Pickwick with a grave and ghost-like air. Mr. Snodgrass was the first to break the astonished silence. He looked steadily at Mr. Grummer for a brief space, and then said emphatically: "This is a private room, sir, a private room." Mr. Grummer shook his head and replied: "No room's private to his Majesty when the street door's once passed; that's law. Some people maintains that an Englishman's house is his castle. That's gammon." The Pickwickians gazed on each other with wondering eyes. "Which is Mr. Tupman?" inquired Mr. Grummer. He had an intuitive perception of Mr. Pickwick. He knew him at once. "My name's Tupman," said that gentleman. "My name's Law," said Mr. Grummer. "What?" said Mr. Tupman. "Law," replied Mr. Grummer. "Law, civil power, and executive. Them's my titles. Here's my authority. Blank Tupman, blank Pickwick, against the peace of our suff'rin lord the king. Stat it in the case made and perwided, and all regular. I apprehend you, Pickwick. Tupman, the aforesaid." "What do you mean by this insolence?" said Mr. Tupman, starting up. "Leave the room." "Hullo!" said Mr. Grummer, retreating very expeditiously to the door, and opening it an inch or two. "Doubleigh?" "Well?" said a deep voice from the passage. "Come for'ard, Doubleigh." At the word of command, a dirty faced man, something over 6 feet high, and stout in proportion, squeezed himself through the half open door, making his face very red in the process, and entered the room. "Is the other specials outside, Doubleigh?" inquired Mr. Grummer. Mr. Doubleigh, who was a man of few words, nodded assent. "Order in the diwision under your charge, Doubleigh," said Mr. Grummer. Mr. Doubleigh did as he was desired, and half a dozen men, each with a short truncheon and a brass crown, flocked into the room. Mr. Grummer pocketed his staff and looked at Mr. Doubleigh. Mr. Doubleigh pocketed his staff and looked at the division. The division pocketed their staves and looked at Messrs. Tupman and Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick and his followers rose as one man. "What is the meaning of this atrocious intrusion upon my privacy?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Who dares apprehend me?" said Mr. Tupman. "What do you want here, scoundrels?" said Mr. Snodgrass. Mr. Winkle said nothing, but he fixed his eyes on Grummer, and bestowed a look upon him which, if he had had any feeling, must have pierced his brain. As it was, however, it had no visible effect on him whatever. When the executive perceived that Mr. Pickwick and his friends were disposed to resist the authority of the law, they very significantly turned up their coat sleeves, as if knocking them down in the first instance, and taking them up afterwards, were a mere professional act, which had only to be thought of to be done, as a matter of course. This demonstration was not lost upon Mr. Pickwick. He conferred a few moments with Mr. Tupman apart, and then signified his readiness to proceed to the mayor's residence, merely begging the parties then and there assembled to take notice that it was his firm intention to resent this monstrous invasion of his privileges as an Englishman the instant he was at liberty. Whereat the parties then and there assembled laughed very heartily, with the single exception of Mr. Grummer, who seemed to consider that any slight cast upon the divine right of magistrates was a species of blasphemy not to be tolerated. But when Mr. Pickwick had signified his readiness to bow to the laws of his country, and just when the waiters and hostlers and chambermaids and postboys, who had anticipated a delightful commotion from his threatened obstinacy, began to turn away, disappointed and disgusted, a difficulty arose which had not been foreseen. With every sentiment of veneration for the constituted authorities, Mr. Pickwick resolutely protested against making his appearance in the public streets, surrounded and guarded by the officers of justice, like a common criminal. Mr. Grummer, in the then disturbed state of public feeling, for it was half holiday and the boys had not yet gone home, as resolutely protested against walking on the opposite side of the way, and taking Mr. Pickwick's parole that he would go straight to the magistrates. And both Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Tupman as strenuously objected to the expense of a post coach, which was the only respectable conveyance that could be obtained. The dispute ran high, and the dilemma lasted long, and just as the executive were on the point of overcoming Mr. Pickwick's objection to walking to the magistrates by the trite expedient of carrying him thither, it was recollected that there stood in the inn yard an old sedan chair, which, having been originally built for a gouty gentleman with funded property, would hold Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Tupman at least as conveniently as a modern post chaise. The chair was hired and brought into the hall. Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Tupman squeezed themselves inside and pulled down the blinds. A couple of chairmen were speedily found, and the procession started in grand order. The specials surrounded the body of the vehicle. Mr. Grummer and Mr. Doubleigh marched triumphantly in front. Mr. Snodgrass and Mr. Winkle walked arm in arm behind, and the unsoaped of Ipswich brought up the rear. The shopkeepers of the town, although they had a very indistinct notion of the nature of the offence, could not but be much edified and gratified by this spectacle. Here was the strong arm of the law coming down with 20 gold-beater force upon two offenders from the metropolis itself. The mighty engine was directed by their own magistrate and worked by their own officers, and both the criminals, by their united efforts, were securely shut up in the narrow compass of one sedan chair. Many were the expressions of approval and admiration which greeted Mr. Grummer as he headed the cavalcade, staff in hand. Loud and long were the shouts raised by the unsoaped, and amidst these united testimonials of public approbation the procession moved slowly and majestically along. Mr. Weller, habited in his mourning jacket with the black calico sleeves, was returning in a rather desponding state from an unsuccessful survey of the mysterious house with the green gate, when, raising his eyes, he beheld a crowd pouring down the street, surrounding an object which had very much the appearance of a sedan chair. Willing to divert his thoughts from the failure of his enterprise, he stepped aside to see the crowd pass, and finding that they were cheering away, very much to their own satisfaction, forthwith began, by way of raising his spirits, to cheer too with all his might and main. Mr. Grummer passed, and Mr. Dubbley passed, and the sedan passed, and the bodyguard of specials passed, and Sam was still responding to the enthusiastic cheers of the mob, and waving his hat about as if he were in the very last extreme of the wildest joy, though of course he had not the faintest idea of the matter in hand, when he was suddenly stopped by the unexpected appearance of Mr. Winkle and Mr. Snodgrass. "What's the row, gentlemen?" cried Sam. "Who have they got in this here watch box in mournin'?" Both gentlemen replied together, but their words were lost in the tumult. "Who is it?" cried Sam again. Once more was a joint reply returned, and though the words were inaudible, Sam saw by the motion of the two pairs of lips that they had uttered the magic word "Pickwick." This was enough. In another minute Mr. Weller had made his way through the crowd, stopped the chairman, and confronted the portly Grummer. "Hullo, old gentleman," said Sam, "who have you got in this here conweyance?" "Stand back," said Mr. Grummer, whose dignity, like the dignity of a great many other men, had been wondrously augmented by a little popularity. "Knock him down if he don't," said Mr. Dubbley. "I'm wery much obliged to you, old gentleman," replied Sam, "for consulting my conwenience, and I'm still more obliged to the other gentleman, who looks as if he'd just escaped from a giant's carawan, for his wery handsome suggestion. But I should prefer your giving me a answer to my question, if it's all the same to you. How are you, sir?" This last observation was addressed with a patronizing air to Mr. Pickwick, who was peeping through the front window. Mr. Grummer, perfectly speechless with indignation, dragged the truncheon with the brass crown from its particular pocket, and flourished it before Sam's eyes. "Ah," said Sam, "it's wery pretty, especially the crown, which is uncommon like the real one." "Stand back," said the outraged Mr. Grummer. By way of adding force to the command, he thrust the brass emblem of royalty into Sam's neckcloth with one hand, and seized Sam's collar with the other, a compliment which Mr. Weller returned by knocking him down out of hand, having previously, with the utmost consideration, knocked down a chairman for him to lie upon. Whether Mr. Winkle was seized with the temporary attack of that species of insanity which originates in a sense of injury, or animated by this display of Mr. Weller's valor, is uncertain. But certain it is, that he no sooner saw Mr. Grummer fall, than he made a terrific onslaught on a small boy who stood next him. Whereupon Mr. Snodgrass, in a truly Christian spirit, and in order that he might take no one unawares, announced in a very loud tone that he was going to begin, and proceeded to take off his coat with the utmost deliberation. He was immediately surrounded and secured, and it is but common justice, both to him and Mr. Winkle, to say that they did not make the slightest attempt to rescue either themselves or Mr. Weller, who, after a most vigorous resistance, was overpowered by numbers and taken prisoner. The procession then reformed, the chairmen resumed their stations, and the march was recommenced. Mr. Pickwick's indignation during the whole of this proceeding was beyond all bounds. He could just see Sam upsetting the specials and flying about in every direction, and that was all he could see, for the sedan doors wouldn't open and the blinds wouldn't pull up. At length, with the assistance of Mr. Tupman, he managed to push open the roof, and mounting on the seat, and steadying himself as well as he could by placing his hand on that gentleman's shoulder, Mr. Pickwick proceeded to address the multitude, to dwell upon the unjustifiable manner in which he had been treated, and to call upon them to take notice that his servant had been first assaulted. In this order they reached the magistrate's house, the chairman trotting, the prisoners following, Mr. Pickwick oratorizing, and the crowd shouting. Chapter 25.